Hello, my name is Olurotimi Osha. Today is July the 22nd, 2026, and it's been a few days since Christopher Nolan's uh, release of uh, his remake of Homer's Greek epic, the Odyssey, and indications are that Christopher Nolan has already scored his largest box office hit to date. The Odyssey has already recouped its massive $250 million budget in 3 days with its global opening. It's raked in $264 million already. And it's, like I said, Christopher Nolan's biggest box office hit. So it's the financial success is there, but that's not what I want to talk about. I've seen a few clips. I haven't seen the entire movie, but I've seen a few clips here and there from reviews. People are posting bits and pieces of it, and so I've seen just a few scenes. And from what I've read, I discovered that Christopher Nolan's creative liberties took out some very critical parts of the Odyssey. So the Odyssey is often considered the greatest story ever told. I read the book. I read Evie Rowe's version. I loved it. Um, that's Evie Rowe's translation. It's the Odyssey is a masterpiece. Obviously, it's almost 3,000 years, and they can't tell that we tell the story enough. Um, but there are some critical parts because for lovers of the classics, you want to understand the essence of the story, the Odyssey. The storytelling is more important for lovers of the classics, and some things that were taken out. There's quite a bit that I've noticed, but like I said, I won't start limiting the time I spend on these videos so I don't pack too much information and make the videos too long. So I'm going to just take a few critical aspects that Christopher Nolan left out. Christopher Nolan seems to have focused a lot on the homecoming aspect of the Odyssey, the journey. He's pining to return home, right? Um, and that's called nostos, right? The desire to be restored to his homeland, to find his identity that he left behind in his homeland. That's part of Greek mythology. The Odyssey exposes us to a lot of the notions and values in Greek mythology. I particularly I relish Greek mythology because I read Greek mythology since I was a child. I was very, thanks to my father, there are all the Greek mythologies, the books on my shelf in my home, in my library. And so I was very familiar with a lot of Greek mythology. But this particular story, the Odyssey, it's about some very important things. Again, Nostos, and he tries to tell that, but he left out an important aspect, right? An important part of the story, and that was um, his stay among the Phaeacians, right, in the island of Scheria, right, amongst the Phaeacians. No, Christopher Nolan left out um, Nausicaa. The Phaeacians were humans. So a huge part of the story of the Odyssey is about Xenia. That was the rule of hospitality as ordered and protected by the Olympian god Zeus, right? This was a very huge part of the story, and you, if and the Phaeacians, right? The Phaeacians in the hospitality they extended to Odysseus without knowing who he was. Um, it their hospitality, the way they welcomed him, they epitomized the perfect Xenia, right? Xenia, that's what it was called amongst the Greeks. That was the rule of the law of hospitality to strangers, right? uh, so Xenia is so important because it was a violation of hot Xenia, this this law of hospitality, mutual hospitality between the host and the guest. It was a violation that led to the Trojan War. That's the Iliad, the first part. And when Paris, who was the son of the king of Troy, is a guest of Agamemnon, not Agamemnon, sorry, Menelaus, right, who was the husband of Helen of Troy. She was Helen of Sparta at the time. And then he abducts her, he elopes with her, takes her to Troy. So that was a violation of the law of Xenia, right? So, and of course, the Greeks retaliated, and they had to try and reclaim their honor, and they fought against the Trojans. So that was the whole essence. And you see there these violations, it's recurrent. And another scene that they left out was Odysseus's complete interaction with the Cyclops. That's Polyphemus, who was the son of Poseidon, the sea god, right? So Polyphemus, that's the Cyclops, violated the rule of Xenia, the rule of hospitality, because the reason Odysseus and his men, they stayed behind because they saw his food and they were going to just take his provisions and leave. But Odysseus was like, no, they're going to hang out because the owner of the house, the owner of the cave, they didn't know who he was. That was Polyphemus, the Cyclops, owed them the law of hospitality, which was protected and ordered by Zeus. And Polyphemus is the nephew of Zeus, but his father hates, Zeus. I mean, they're rivals. They don't get along so well, and so the Cyclops, right, insults that law, right? He sort of poo-poos, he denigrates that law, disparages it by eating Odysseus's men and saying he was going to eat all of them and just trapping them in, right? So that was very important. And something else that we didn't, that we don't see, Christopher Nolan altered an aspect of that interaction, right? When the way they escaped, Christopher Nolan apparently never reenacts where Odysseus tells Polyphemus, the Cyclops, that his name was Nobody. That was very, very important, right? Because when Odysseus tells him he is nobody, you are able to see the intelligence of Odysseus. So the intelligence of Odysseus as a strategic person was very important as well, because it also contrasts him with the more muscular, macho, all brawny Achilles. Achilles was just all power, all brute force, but Odysseus was more intelligent, right? So you see the contrast, and it shows he was sort of projecting, he was representing the ingenuity of mankind, of human beings, even though he was being manipulated by the Greek gods, right? His destiny was being intervened and being manipulated by the Greek gods, but through his ingenuity, he would escape one, crisis after the other in his circuitous journey, and his wandering, his 10-year wanderings, right? So Odysseus's intelligence is very important, and it's demonstrated in that moment when he lies to the Cyclops that his name was Nobody. That encounter was very, very important, because even though he had successfully escaped the Cyclops by giving him the fake name Nobody, because his brothers, when they heard him screaming after they had used the stick to blind him. By the way, in the film, I see they used Odysseus only blinds him after they escape from the cave, and he uses an arrow, right? So that wasn't what happened in the book. In the book, Odysseus blinds him and then devises another ingenious method to escape from the cave, right? And when the Cyclops' brothers hear him wailing and he's screaming because he's blinded, and they're asking who's harming him, and he's trying to tell them that it's Odysseus, but he doesn't know Odysseus' name because Odysseus lied to him and said his name was nobody. So he's saying nobody's hurting me, nobody's hurting me. So, and the humor in that part, that place is so funny. You can see the humor of the Greeks, 3,000 years ago, right? So, uh, so Christopher Nolan left that part. I expected he would reenact that because that's such an important part of the book. And we see after Odysseus successfully escapes, right? He's very intelligent and he makes it onto his ship. He escapes, gets out of the cave, but he couldn't resist, the hubris. He couldn't resist the, to just stick it back to the Cyclops to let him know who it was that really injured him and outwitted him. He told him, hey, if anybody asks you who blinded you, tell them it's Odysseus, the sacker of cities. You see the hubris, the hubris of Odysseus at that time, at that moment. And that was what got him into trouble because the Cyclops now knew who it was that had, blinded him. And then he cries out to his father, Poseidon, and Poseidon then curses him and makes him wander for 10 years. So that is a very critical part, right? It's these very important parts of the movie. So again, and with respect to his contact with the Phaeacians, this is so important because so you see, Nolan focuses on the Gnostus aspect, right, of the Greek civilization. Odysseus is trying to get back home, right, to reclaim his identity in his homeland. That's Gnostus. But the Xenia aspect, right, because Odysseus, again, Christopher Nolan appears to misrepresent Odysseus's hubris. Odysseus's hubris with mortals, but not with the gods. He fears the gods, right? That's why the gods sort of favor him, right? He fears, if you remember, Athena protected him, Hermes protected him, and eventually Athena goes to appeal to her father, the chief of the gods, that's Zeus, and Zeus eventually, orders, his wanderings or orders Calypso to let him go, to let him return to his homeland. So Odysseus, it was just his hubris with other mortals, right? He thought, oh well, he's so much smarter than the Cyclops. That was when he demonstrates hubris. But when we consider the Xenia aspect, that's a hospitality aspect, right? You see that the Phaeacians, right? The Phaeacians were humans like Odysseus, right? So Odysseus was pining for his own homeland. Ithaca wasn't rich, right? He was a king of Ithaca, but Ithaca wasn't rich like the land of the Phaeacians. The Phaeacians were very wealthy. They were very rich. And so when Odysseus was staying with Calypso, when he was held captive by Calypso, who was a goddess, a sea goddess, right, for 7 years, and she was asking him to marry her, that if he married her, she would offer him, immortality, right? So he wouldn't go old, he wouldn't die. She was offering him immortality. Well, you could understand that. Well, he chose the life of a mortal, right? He chose to be human instead of being, a god, an immortal, right? You can see the contrast. You weren't comparing. He still preferring his wife who was aging, right? Him preferring to go back to his home, his family, and his wife. They were mortals. That was comparing mortals with immortals. So that was not a perfect symbolism of his need for Gnostus to refine his identity. You see that perfect character of Odysseus when he's now placed with other humans, that's the Phaeacians, and he's with Nausicaa, who's a younger woman, and his wife, and she's noble, she has virtue. And he could have stayed there because the father offered him to marry his daughter and he would give Odysseus his kingdom, right? He would inherit Odysseus would inherit his kingdom if he married his daughter. And of course, his kingdom was wealthier than Ithaca, his wife. The daughter was younger than his wife, right? Who was, but Odysseus still wanted his own true identity, which he left back in Ithaca, and that was what he wanted to return to, right? So you could see that contrast. You could see that appreciation of Nostos, the real value of that Nostos, that as sense of identity which he had with the people he knew and left behind in Ithaca, right? You see that when you're able to contrast his stay and the offer, the proposal he had in amongst the Phaeacians, in contrast to what he had left behind in Ithaca, right? He still was pining for the wife of his youth. That was Penelope, who was middle-aged like him, as opposed to the younger Nausicaa, who was the daughter of King Alcinous and the Queen Ariet. And something else that was significant about his interaction with the Phaeacians. This was a very critical part, and I thought Christopher Nolan would have taken advantage of it. Homer was channeling himself. Remember, Homer was a blind poet. He was a blind poet, and bards back then, the poems were they sang the bards in the court of the palace of the king of the Phaeacians. There was a blind bard. He was blind, just like Homer. So it was like Homer inserted himself in the play. This was ingenious, right? It was like an ingenious device. Homer inserts himself. He's the bard. He's playing a musical device, right? A harp. He's playing. Is it a harpsichord or something? He's playing He's playing a musical instrument, and he is doing what Homer was doing for us. Homer was telling the story of Odysseus. He tells us the story of the Iliad, the Trojan War, and that was exactly what the bard was doing in the courtroom of the Phaeacians. He was talking about Odysseus, talking about how the Greeks went. Again, the Greeks were called the Achaeans back then. So how they went to fight the Trojans because of Helen of Troy and all of that. So he was telling the story about their glorious strategy, their military victories, and the honor and how they became so famous, right? So he was doing what Homer does for us by telling the story of the Odyssey. So you actually see it. We would have been able to appreciate that, where Homer channels himself, inserts himself inside the story. But Christopher Nolan, left out that removed that opportunity. So that was a very important part, a very ingenious device, and that was where Odysseus then starts crying, and they realize, why is this guy crying? Because all throughout that time, the Phaeacians who had, epitomized xenia or hospitality, because they just welcomed a naked stranger and showed him a hospitality. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know he was the famous Odysseus that the bard was singing about, that all the Greeks talked about, and who came up with the ingenious strategy of using the Trojan horse to invade the impregnable walls of Troy. So that was very important. And another part that they left out, and this video is getting too long, so I'm going to have to tell the other aspects, right? Other significant aspects. But I'm going to just describe the last important scene that was left out. When Odysseus goes to meet the blind prophet Tiresias in the underworld, right? That was the land of the dead. I thought this was very important, right? It was another very important part, because the Greeks celebrated military glory, and you see the Iliad was all about the military might and honor and the glory of the very proud Achilles, right? But he sees Achilles in the underworld, and he's sad. And Odysseus is reminding him about his military exploits when he was alive. But Achilles sadly tells him that, you know what, he would rather be a slave to a tenant farmer, a poor tenant farmer, than be king of the underworld. And you see, um, for me, it was so important because the way it was told, it just reminds you of a portion in the Bible, right? The book of Ecclesiastes, that's a Greek word that actually means the preacher. And the whole theme of Ecclesiastes in the Bible is saying the world is, vanity upon vanities, right? So that's an analogy with the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, right? How life is full of vanities, and that's basically what Achilles is saying, that all the military exploits that he achieved when he was alive, it meant nothing while he was dead and in the underworld, right? And of course, the interaction between Odysseus and his mother, because his mother had died of grief, and he saw her in the underworld. So all these parts were very significant. There's more I want to talk about. I'll do another video and I'll talk about it. And that was the end, the twist in the end. That isn't how it ends. In the end, Odysseus he slaughters the suitors, and after he slaughters the suitors, he does some sacrifices. The book doesn't talk about the sacrifices, but Tiresias had told him, this was what he had to do to appease Poseidon. But Odysseus lives on in his kingdom after the brutal massacre of the suitors that he executed, and his son hanged the disloyal, treacherous maidservants who slept with the suitors. But in the movie, Odysseus, for slaughtering, because of the brutal way he massacred the suitors, is said to have been exiled, right? That's not quite what happens, right? So that was a lot of creative liberty by Christopher Nolan. But on the whole, apparently the young audience, especially they said Gen Z, enjoyed it, and of course that's been responsible for the remarkable financial success that it's had so far. I'll do another video and continue with the changes in the reenactment of Christopher Nolan's rendition of Homer's The Odyssey. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.